Let's go over multiple intelligence theory. This was developed by Howard Gardner. Originally, he had 7, and then he added an 8th, and that was naturalistic, was the last intelligence that he added to the theory. And this is important for adapting to teaching styles. That's the reason I've included it in the class, because you need to understand how you learn best. And then once you understand how you like to process information, you can take that, whatever's presented to you, process it in a way that makes it efficient for you to take that information in. And it's not saying that you don't need to work on areas that you may be weak in, but let's get the information internalized first so that you can process it, think about it, use it, and then you can start to develop those other areas that maybe you have deficiencies in. So I'm just going to talk about this for me for a second. So for me, I'm a very visual spatial learner, and this is a good way to think about it, to try to reflect on how historically you've liked to take information in. What is intuitive for you? What makes it easy to process new and novel information? What do you like to focus on first? And for me, visual spatial. There's got to be visuals. I'm not a very good listener, so verbal linguistic, not so great. The first way I want information is visually. Now, it can be paired with verbal. That's great. I can take that in. And most people are what's coined as multimodal, meaning like you want information paired in multiple modes. For the vast majority of people, that's visual spatial and verbal linguistic. They want some sort of visual information paired with some sort of auditory description, but not everybody. The third on this list is bodily kinesthetic. I am a kinesthetic learner. That's why I love hands-on activities, even if there's a theoretical concept. If you can give me something that I can take that theory or educational theory and apply it to, I'll have a much better time processing that information. I'll be way more efficient at taking that information in if I have some sort of hands-on component or some sort of project to apply it to. So for me, the big ones are visual spatial, verbal linguistic, bodily kinesthetic, if we're looking at Howard Gardner's theory. Now, we're going to simplify this in the second half of the week, and I'll talk about it a little bit in this lecture. Now, one of the worst intelligences for me is musical rhythmic. I have no music ability. I'm terrible when it comes to rhythm, and that's one most of my life I've shied away from. Logical mathematical. I thought I was terrible at math until I actually put forth the effort to learn mathematics and found that I was actually fairly good at math because it's procedural, it's process oriented. A lot of people that are kinesthetic learners that learn by doing, a lot of skills are procedural. They're steps that you follow. You do things in a certain sequence. And they tend to be fairly good at math. Now, maybe they've shied away from math, but I think for most individuals that are truly kinesthetic, that have that ability to learn procedural information, that are process-oriented, once they learn the basics of mathematics, then they tend to do fairly well. It's not everybody. Now, I am a naturalistic learner. I like to learn from nature. So if you like hunting, fishing, trapping, biology, ethnobotany, anything dealing with environmental science, you're probably a naturalistic learner. And that's the whole reason for the activities. The theme that I've chosen for most of my classes has a naturalistic component, and mainly because it can be difficult to include that into a class if I want students to kind of experience that, to test it out, to see if they're a naturalistic learner. Some people don't know that they are. until they see that classification and they start paying attention to the information that is intuitive to them to learn, meaning it's super easy for them to process that information. So that's the reason I've chosen the theme that we're using in class is to bring that naturalistic component. That's not all my classes. I do have other themes, but for the ones that are centered around survival, primitive fire, those are more naturalistic. Foraging. A lot of times I will adopt those themes in all the activities that we do. Even though it's an education class, I like to have that naturalistic theme to try to motivate those students that are naturalistic learner and capture them and engage them in dialogue. And what I mean by capture is capture their interest in the subject that I'm talking about. Most won't be interested in educational theory until they see how it applies to them, and this is one of the ways that I try to capture the interest of students, is to bring that naturalistic component into class. And like we talked about last class, the reason I have social learning is so that students can see the importance of interpersonal intelligence, being able to communicate, to know where you fit within a group, to pick up on group dynamics, to know how to work well with others. That's all interpersonal intelligence. It goes into interpersonal communication. And then intrapersonal. If interpersonal is knowing how to work with others, intrapersonal is knowing oneself. Having a good understanding of who you are, your strengths, your weaknesses, how you're going to fit in. Having that interpersonal intelligence helps you fit in with the group. So these are often confused, but they do go hand in hand. Interpersonal, working within groups. I know I'm repeating myself, but this is the question or the concept that most people in the class get confused. So interpersonal, knowing how to interact with other people. Intrapersonal, knowing oneself. And you can see how understanding yourself can help you and benefit you in group interactions. If I'm an introvert and the group needs a leader and I've never taken on a leadership role and I'm still kind of shying away from it, maybe I don't want to take the leadership role because I know myself. Maybe I wouldn't be a good fit for that group. Or with that same example, maybe I am an introvert. I've never taken on a leadership role, but I'm interested. And I just want to see how I would do. This is a class. It's a good, safe place to test that out before you move into your career. Maybe you're an exceptional leader, even as an introvert. And the reverse of that, the inverse of that, could be said for an extrovert. Somebody that's outgoing, charismatic, maybe they get along great with others, maybe they've done a lot of team sports and they can lead the group because they've had a lot of leadership experience, and nobody wants to step up the role of the leader, but your group needs a leader. Knowing yourself, knowing that about yourself, may help out your group because then you could take on that role. All right, let's reflect back to the previous lecture where we talked about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. This is the reason that we are covering interpersonal communication, intrapersonal communication, because it can help you out in both of these areas. If you know you're an introvert and you're really good at getting things done independently, maybe you need to communicate that to your group. Say, hey, I'm really good at this part. I'll do this on my own. I'm way more efficient. I'm going to take this home. I'll get it done. I'll bring it back to class, next class period. And you communicate that to your group. So once class ends, you can go work independently. And maybe that's a better situation for you because you are not distracted. Or you're an extrovert. And like I said before, the group needs a leader. And you take that role on so that you understood yourself, interpersonal intelligence, so that you could help the group out because they needed a leader, interpersonal intelligence, knowing how to your role within that group. So that's how multiple intelligence theory links back to the social learning models that we learned last class period. Okay, this is getting into next class and why we're covering learning style and how it's related to multiple intelligence theory. So think multiple intelligence theory a little bit more complicated, right? We have 8 major intelligences. That can be hard to apply on a daily basis when you're just thinking about your own learning. Once you get the concepts of interpersonal communication, intrapersonal communication, naturalistic learning, now let's think of the larger topics, the more broad topics. And I had y'all do an assessment at the beginning of the semester, which was called the VARK inventory: visual, auditory, reading and writing, and kinesthetic. So they're lumping reading and writing together. Now, how do we use that on a daily basis? What I've got drawn out here is the beginning stage of information processing. We'll get to that later. I don't want to cover it too much. But in a nutshell, you have environmental stimulus that come in: smell, touch, taste, hearing, all that good stuff. And if you pay attention to it, you can move it on to short-term memory. That is a very simplified example. And then from short-term memory, if you rehearse it enough, you can get it over into long-term memory. All right, that's as simple as I can explain information processing theory. Let's focus on the attention phase, because that's really where your learning styles come in. You can have all this environmental stimulation coming in, but if you don't pay attention to it, you lose it. It never even captures your attention. So it's not that you knew it and you forgot it. It just never made its way in because you didn't pay attention to it. Now, when new information presents itself to you, what do you focus on first? The visual, the auditory? Would you like to read about it or write it down? Or would you like to act it out? Maybe it's a skill. Kinesthetic component, hands-on learning. How do you want that information? Well, for most people, like I said earlier, they're multimodal. And the majority of people, if you look at the link that I gave you, if you go to their research page, most are multimodal. And the most common modes that are combined, multimodal learners, are visual, auditory. And then behind that would be visual, auditory, kinesthetic. That's me. I want all 3 of those. If I'm going to really retain something, I want some sort of hands-on piece to it. Think of a biology lab. I would rather go do the lab first, get the hands-on pieces, practice the models. Maybe it's a chemistry lab, right? I want to go to that lab, practice the experiment, do some hands-on learning, and then go to lecture. That's not how most of our classes are designed. We tend to go do the lecture material first, where we listen to it. We might read about it and write it down. You might see some visual components. But for me, I think I would be better off going in, reading, writing, listening about the lab, and then go do those experiments, and then go to lecture. I think I would benefit more. That's just knowing how I learn. I would be way more efficient with that. But you can see this is linked to multiple intelligence theory because it is the beginning stage of what we talked about earlier. The reading and writing and auditory are lumped up in linguistic and verbal of multiple intelligence theory. But this is way easier to think about. It's way easier to apply to your daily learning. And that's how I want you to think about the rest of the semester. When I present you with new information, am I giving that to you in your most efficient way to take it in? Is it helping you pay attention to it in the way I'm presenting it? Because I try to present in several different modes. I try to give you the information visually. I try to have you listen to the lecture. I draw something out on the board, a diagram, much like what you're seeing here. I have you read about it. Hopefully you're preparing before you come to class and reading the lectures, watching the videos, another visual component with audio combined. Your discussions have you write about it. And then we have some sort of activity we can apply it to. That is the purpose of those daily activities. The reason they're hands-on is because I want you to have a kinesthetic component so we can cover all aspects of learning. Because just a rough survey of my classes, most students that I talk to really need this kinesthetic component. I would say almost half will tell me that they are kinesthetic learners. So having that activity really helps take that explicit knowledge, that theoretical concept, and have it sink in by combining it with the implicit side. Now we're going to break up implicit learning into procedural, like muscle memory, and then we'll eventually take that and talk about motivation and its role in behavior. So I don't want you to think implicit is only procedural. It's not. But we'll eventually start talking about the motivational component, the behavioral component in the second half of the semester. So I'm intentionally leaving that out for right now. All right, multiple intelligence theory, learning styles, social learning connection. Let's tie this all up from the last lecture to this one. That is called conceptual learning, which we'll get to. Linking concepts. We're also going to bring in a component that we'll talk about when we get to information processing in week 6, which is blocking or chunking information. That's essentially what we're doing here. So you see visual spatial, verbal linguistic, bodily kinesthetic, all of those tie in to learning style, what we just talked about. Musical rhythmic, logical mathematical because it's procedural, and naturalistic because of the activities I've chosen, all lump in with the daily activity. So musical rhythmic, we're going to have an activity that requires rhythm. That's why not only is it combined with kinesthetic here, that's why I brought those two fairly close together, because they are related. Think of dance. That is not only kinesthetic, but there is a musical rhythmic aspect to it. Same thing with playing some instruments, like think of playing a drum. It has not only that musical component, but there is a rhythm to that as well, but it is kinesthetic. You have to be fairly active to do that activity. So I tried to block and chunk these into related terms. So visual, spatial, verbal, linguistic, bodily, kinesthetic, those are all part of our learning styles that we'll discuss. Musical rhythmic, not only is it close to kinesthetic, logical, mathematical, naturalistic, that's connected to our daily activities. And interpersonal, intrapersonal, well, we know how that ties into social learning theory because we just talked about it. And that, in a nutshell, is conceptual learning. We're taking the previous concepts and connecting it to this week's concepts. And we'll do that throughout the whole semester. And there's our references.